I mean, is there evidence, real evidence, that transferring management from public control to private control increases efficiency? That's a little tricky, because when you begin to look, you find a lot of other things. For example, what you find is that in places where the society sort of functions kind of more or less honestly and well, you know, say Sweden or Chile for that matter, public institutions are pretty efficient. So there is no pressure in Chile to privatize the biggest exporter, because it's very efficient. Where there's pressure to privatize, it's usually coming from private power, okay, not on grounds of efficiency. And in fact, if you look at the effects, it's very unclear what they are. So, I mean, take, say, the Brazilian steel industry. I mean, it was nationalized, always ran at a loss, okay, so it looks inefficient by some measure. On the other hand, part of the reason it was running at a loss was because it was purposely, by state policy, producing steel cheaply for the benefit of private manufacturers. So it was a public subsidy to private manufacturers, which made the steel industry look inefficient, right? But for the economy, it might not at all have been inefficient. And when you proceed, that's what you find. So like in England, which is, you know, a modern country, they privatized the water system recently. And by economists' measures, it's probably more efficient. On the other hand, people aren't getting water. Poor people don't get water, you know. Yeah, in fact, that's efficient. Like if you had only one, if you were put in charge of the water distribution system, and you're an automaton, all human feelings are gone. Your only interest is maximizing profit. Well, you know perfectly well what you'd do. You'd cut out water altogether for people who, you know, can't pay for it, or are sort of not in some dense area which has a lot of money. Why should they have water at all? I mean, after all, they can go walk somewhere with a bucket on their back and get water. That's probably better by the macroeconomic statistics. So it's more efficient. And in fact, case after case, when you look at privatization, you find an extremely mixed picture. What you usually find is transfer of costs to the public. So take, say, privatization of roads. Well, you know, privatization of roads would mean you'd pay tolls if you're rich enough, and you'd go on nice highways. And if you're not rich enough to pay the tolls, well, you know, find your way down a dirt rut somewhere. You know, the total, you know, the economy might look much better. Gross national product would go up, macroeconomic statistics would look good. For most of the people, it'd be terrible. It's forced on them from the outside. And it might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing, but you have to look at the cases. So, for example, just recently, Brazil privatized the Vale, big, huge industrial mining conglomerate. They sold it off to private power. Well, you know, that's a large part of the future of Brazil is there. Brazil has plenty of resources. There was an analysis of Vale done by, there were two analyses of the value of it. One was done by Merrill Lynch. That's the one the government was using. Merrill Lynch also happens to be, you know, the agent for a lot of the private purchasers and so on. Another was done by the engineering department at the Federal University in Rio. Good, serious people. I know some of them. I was down there about a year ago talking. Very serious industrial engineers and those people. They gave an evaluation of Vale which was far higher, taking into account future needs, you know, what would iron and gold and so on be worth 20 years from now to the people of Brazil and so on. Those considerations weren't taken into account by Merrill Lynch, of course, but they're real. Well, you know, it was sold off, and now private power will make the profit. I can just tell you this much. If you look at take a look at today's rich countries and today's poor countries, first world and third world, go back a couple hundred years, you find they weren't very different. In fact, India was the commercial and manufacturing center of the world in the 18th century. As late as the late 19th century, the British were deeply concerned by the fact that British textiles couldn't compete with Chinese textiles because they were much better and better done and so on. They changed. You know, Egypt started to undergo an industrial revolution about the same time the United States did, with comparable prospects. You know, they had their own cotton, big agricultural area, and so on. Well, you take a look at what happened since the 18th century. Two regions have developed outside of Europe, the United States and Japan. They are exactly the two regions which were able to fend off European control. Okay, the U.S. separated itself. Japan was able to fend off European control. Japan's had the highest growth rate in the world since the Meiji Restoration around 1860. The United States grew very fast. How did they do it? Same way Europe did, by radically interfering with market principles. So from the very beginning, the United States was super protectionist, had massive, large-scale state subsidies and so on and so forth. Britain had done exactly the same. That's how it became the richest country in the world. Every other industrial developing country has done more or less the same thing. I mean, they use somewhat different methods. Like Japan happened to be much more liberal in trading than the United States was. But on the other hand, it had, more authoritarian internal systems, so they vary in one way or another. But invariably, I think there is no exception to this, they did it by sharp interference with market principles. What about the third world? They had what's called neoliberalism is not liberalism, and it's not new. They've had it rammed down their throats for hundreds of years, and that turned them into the third world. Well, one aspect of that is the kind of privatization which leaves power in the hands of usually foreign industry or their local counterparts. We've just seen it go on in Mexico. Mexico's had the biggest privatization in modern history in the last, actually the biggest privatization in history probably is the internet and the whole telecommunication system. Here is a system developed at public expense, which is being given, it's not even sold. It's not privatization, sometimes they sell it for something. Here we just give it away, to private power. So that's huge privatization. But in third world countries, I suppose the main case is Mexico. And in fact, yeah, it's true, the Mexican telephone company and so on, they're getting privatized. And you're getting a couple hundred billionaires, service isn't improving except for the rich, getting a small number of billionaires. Wages and incomes have collapsed by, depends how you measure, but maybe 50% during the liberalization period. In 1995, right after the collapse, GNP went down by about 8 or 9%, still not recovering. Yeah, that's privatization.